So I'm excited to be here, and thank you to the organizer, to Professor Carol Myers and Eric Myers and Julie, as well as all others involved in this series for this kind invitation. It is a special honor to be part of this series, which celebrates, among other things, the life of Rabbi Marshall Meyer. No, I did not know him, and I hope some members maybe here of other congregations will not be offended. Out of the probably many dozens of synagogues worldwide in which I spent some time, there was only one which I was really proud to call my synagogue and became a full member, Congregation Bnei Yeshurun, also known as BJ, in New York City. This is the congregation that was revived by Rabbi Meyer and later by his disciples from Argentina. So thank you again, therefore, for the honor to be associated with this project and his blessed memory. For personal reasons, I was not able to be present in the previous presentation in this series by Professor Mark Bettler. Fortunately, I was able to see a video recording of it. At first, it was a little frustrating to see we planned our respective talks in a similar format. Giving though some more thought to it, later it became clear this should not surprise me. We both decided to refer to the most important modern document on the matter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, signed in Paris in 1948. That both Professor Bettler and I chose to use it simply shows we are both products of the 20th century. Professor Bettler decided to arrange his talk according to this declaration and comparing several rights from it to the biblical literature on which he was asked to comment. Independently, before seeing his lecture, I began to do the same. Regarding the literature I was asked to analyze, the rabbinic one. There is even a similarity in some of the rights we chose to discuss. Again, this should not be a surprise, as many of them are among the most fundamental rights in the Declaration. In some cases, the fact that we chose the same right is a good thing and can help see changes between the two corpora of literature. I'm sure that some in this room attended that wonderful talk and some did not. I mentioned some of these similarities for those who were there, but I will also try to make my talk clear and meaningful for those who are not. As Professor Bettler said, this series is anachronistic. Experts of the history of human rights tell us that the idea of human rights began only in the 17th and 18th century. Searching for human rights in the literature I will discuss today is therefore quite meaningless. Even the core ideas of what is human and what are rights had very different definitions or did not exist. But, just like Professor Bettler, I suspect the intention of those creating this fascinating series was to check what aspects of what we call today human rights existed in the Jewish literatures under consideration. And perhaps the entire series will help answer the question of whether things became, with time, better or worse. Professor Bettler asked also if we should check the Jewish recorded text and ideas on the matter relatively or absolutely. When he talked about examining them relatively, I imagine he meant in comparison to non-Jewish texts and ideas from the same time and place. By absolutely, I suspect he meant in comparison to how we think about human rights today. Bettler said, and I quote, "I think we should do both." I agree. But today, for lack of time, and because my research on this is still ongoing, I will do only the absolute comparison. I will invite us to think about what the rabbinic texts say in comparison to what I suspect those of us who feel some relation to these texts would have wanted them to say. As I said, the concept of human rights began in the 17th and 18th century. Two formulations in that period are of extreme importance and are justly famous. The first is the American Declaration of Independence from 1776. Many probably here know the relevant text by heart. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. 30 years later, in 1789, another famous declaration came into being, the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and of Citizens. Its first two articles are of a great relevance. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Social distinctions may be based only on considerations of the common good. 2. The aim of every political association is the preservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of men. These rights are liberty, property, safety, and resistance to oppression. There were other declarations of various kinds in the more than 150 years until 1948. But a declaration signed in 1948 in Paris, 3 years after the end of World War II, and the revelation of the atrocities committed by the Nazis and others, is for now the only one which, in theory, is binding and universal. In theory, because unfortunately even a quick perusal through it reveals how far we are from the ideals expressed in it. These children, posing with the declaration in 1950, would now be in their late 60s. The document is still far from becoming applied universally. I will later use paragraphs from this document as a kind of standard, a ruler next to which I will try to put rabbinic text and see what the comparison tells us. Before we begin to analyze rabbinic text, I believe we need to do two things. The first is to understand what these texts are. The second is to speak a bit about methods, what we can do with these texts and what we cannot, what they can teach us and what they cannot. I want to say this, although many people in this room know these things very well, extremely well, especially because this is a recorded presentation. It will be good maybe to make it available for people outside the small circles of experts of rabbinic literature. The title of my talk, The Rabbis and Human Rights, the Ancient Period, is important in order to understand it. If we know a bit now about which human rights I discuss, we still need to understand who these rabbis of the ancient periods are. Rabbi is a word in Aramaic, a language quite close to Hebrew. It can mean my teacher or my master. The word does not appear in the Jewish Bible, but is related to the biblical Hebrew word rav, great, a lot. It seems to appear for the first time in the 1st century CE in Palestine. Its first appearance in writing, as far as I know, is in a collection of important texts written most probably or surely by Jews. I'm referring, of course, to the New Testament. In this slide you can see one important mention of the term or its derivation in the Gospel according to Matthew, composed probably slightly after the middle of the 1st century. As you can see, the author kept the word rabbi in the Greek texts. He did not feel a need to explain the word to his readers. In this slide we have a similar case in the Gospel according to John, composed probably towards the end of the 1st century. As you can see here again, the author uses the word rabbi in the Greek transliteration, and the author we call John, or a later scribe, added an explanation of the term towards the end, which means teacher. If you go to texts considered Jewish by Jews, and the New Testament is not one of them, even though it's part of it written by Jews, the Tractate of Avot, sometimes called the Tractate of the Fathers from the Mishnah, has in its first chapter a unique concentration of the term rabbi. You can see it now on the screen. We do not know to read this text, and I will not read it. All I wanted to show is how many times the term appears. You can see each time in red there is the term, and the fact that it does not mean the exact same thing each time. Sometimes it should be translated as master, sometimes as teacher, lordship, etc. Gradually, the word rabbi began to mean a type of religious expert, teacher, knowledgeable about ancient traditions and their application. Only much later, in the Middle Ages, did it become a professional title. In the Jewish traditional literature of the 2nd to 7th or so centuries, the main protagonists are called Rabbi X, Rabbi Y, Rabbi Z, and so on. Therefore, we call this literature rabbinic. The people we call today early rabbis were convinced that post-temple recovery of Judaism must be through dedication to what they called the Torah. Although the word Torah is often understood as the Jewish name of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, for the rabbis, Torah meant all possible knowledge about God and God's will. The revelation in Sinai, according to them, included 2 bodies of knowledge, a small written part, the Pentateuch, and a larger oral part. They claim that only those who master the two parts of the Torah are entitled to lead the Jewish nation in the right direction. They said the oral Torah was transmitted through the Pharisees and the scribes. The rabbis saw themselves as heirs of both groups. The Pharisees, during the last decades of the Second Temple, which was destroyed in the year 70 CE, wanted to extend the holiness from the Temple to all realms of life. This decision brought with it high concern for daily rituals. The scribes of the same period occupied themselves with the study of scriptures and with their interpretation. The rabbis of the post-temple period combined these two goals. They collected various pieces of knowledge, lore, and tradition and arranged them systematically. The Mishnah, compiled around the year 210 CE, was the first major systematic production. Some of the texts that were not included in the Mishnah, they collected in another work, called Tosefta. In later generations, these rejected texts and similar works came back into the rabbinic discussion, often while being compared to the Mishnah. After the rabbis completed the Mishnah and made it public, groups of people in Palestine, or as the Jews called it, Eretz Israel, and in current-day Iraq, in the Jewish parlance Babylon, started to study it. They explained obscure parts, discussed possible contradictions, and compared its content to other traditions they had. They tried to find coherence in concepts, decisions, and saying attributed to specific rabbis. They progressively arranged their work in written form, called Talmud or Gemara, meaning in Hebrew and Aramaic, study. They finally created two Talmuds. One, called the Jerusalem or Palestinian Talmud, was composed mostly in the Galilee, partly in the town of Sephoris or Tzipori, excavated by two experts here, Professor Carl and Eric Myers. Its finalized version is from around 400 CE. The second Talmud is the Babylonian one. It comes from academies in current-day Iraq. Double in size and much better edited and organized, the fact that it had about another century helped its being better organized. It gained higher position and status in Jewish culture. When people speak about the Talmud, they refer to the Babylonian one. Parallel to the production of the Mishnah and Talmud, another corpus of literature came to being, the Midrash. The Midrash is more than anything a certain method of interpretation of biblical text, but we call the genre of these texts produced with this method Midrash. A great number of collections of texts of this kind from the same period of the Mishnah and Talmud exist, and they make also part of the classic literature of the rabbis that I explore. This slide provides a rough summary of the time and places of origin of all of these texts. In this simple visual presentation, very generalized, you can see we are talking about works produced over a long period of time and in two geographical centers. Each of these centers was made of multiple subgroups of rabbis. The number of rabbis we know of it is not enormous, but it includes several hundreds of names. Thus, this history involves many people over several centuries in different places. Obviously, it includes also different opinions on many matters. Moreover, the testimonies we have about the opinions of the rabbis are problematic. First, the Talmudic literature itself is not always unified about who said what. The formula Rabbi X, and some said Rabbi Y, said is common. And even when such vagaries do not appear in the text itself, we see them often in manuscript. One manuscript might say that Rabbi X said A, another manuscript might say that Rabbi Y said A, or still another that Rabbi X said B. Until a few decades ago, this was something sometimes forgotten. An attempt to provide a unified view of the teaching of the so-called sages were not unheard of. Scholars created biographies, or at least intellectual biographies, of rabbis, and sometimes assumed there were consensus among rabbis regarding a significant amount of topics. Today, for all the reasons I mentioned and others, such as the cognition that all the texts we have were heavily edited by editors who lived centuries after the original sayings may have been uttered, the practice is rare or extinct. Some scholars would say that a given statement teaches us, at best, about the opinions of the final editor or even later scribes. Others might say that often it might teach us about the opinion of the specific rabbi. Most scholars today would place themselves somewhere in between these two extremes, and I generally do the same. With that background information, we are ready to delve into rabbinic literature and see what we can find there about what we call today human rights. First, we will address two important questions. Who is human, according to this literature, and do such humans have rights? The Universal Declaration of 1948 does not define who is human, but takes it for granted that we recognize it when we see one. Let us look at the first part of the first article. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience. At the same time, it does say all humans are endowed with reason and conscience. The very term reason, and much more so conscience, are vague enough that one can argue this definition does not exclude any human, even if in a vegetative state, for example. The Declaration says that all those individuals we call humans are born, quote, free and equal in dignity and rights. Free and equal in dignity and rights in the eyes of whom, you might ask? In such a secular document, the answer is, most probably, in the eyes of other humans. What did the rabbis say? Did they consider all those the Declaration considers humans to be also of one type? A few texts might be relevant to the question. The first one is from the Mishnah. The Mishnah is divided into 63 parts or tractates. 62 of them deal mostly with legal issues. One deals mostly with questions of ethics and society. I'm referring again to the same tractate I mentioned earlier, the Tractate of Avot. Rabbi Akiva used to say, human being, or Adam, is beloved because he was created in the image of God. Still greater love is that this was made known to him, that he was created in the image of God, as it is said, for in the image of God was Adam created. Beloved are Israel, for they were called the sons of God. Still greater love is that this was made known to them, that they were called sons of God, as it is said, you are the sons of the Lord your God. The main word in the first paragraph, Adam, seems to refer to what we call human. In the Bible, this is rather clear. Certainly in the very beginning of Genesis, where there is no story yet of any special group, and all those we call humans are said to be descendants of the same creature, Adam. The Bible appears to say that what unites us all is the fact we have a common ancestor. Of course, after Darwin, this might not be such a convincing argument. If a human, a cat, a fly, and a microbe all have also the same ancestor in some really ancient soup. We might today perhaps find it better to define humans by certain characteristics in DNA. The Bible and the rabbis evidently did not have this as an option. The Mishnah text does not end with the first paragraph, though. It says that Israel, the real or imagined group we call Jews, are particularly beloved for two reasons. God called them sons, and God gave them the Torah. Unlike the Universal Declaration's first article, this Mishnaic text does not consider all human to have the same status in the eyes of the one who matters, God in this context. But at the same time, it does say that all humans share a certain status of belovedness in the eyes of God, something which distinguishes them from all other creatures who are not created in the image of God. A second important text is the following. It was taught. So this is from the Babylonian Talmud Tractate Yevamot. It was taught. And so did Rabbi Simon ben Yochai, or Bar Yochai, state that the graves of idolaters do not impart impurity by a tent, for it is said, and you, my sheep, the sheep of my pasture, are humans, Adam. You are called humans, Adam, but the idolaters are not called humans. This text is a legal one, dealing with a type of impurity called impurity of a human corpse, and one of the ways this impurity spreads. This way is called tent impurity, and according to it, if a human corpse or even small parts of it are under a tent or any other structure that covers it from above, be it a sarcophagus, a tent, a building, a person, or a tree, everything found under that structure becomes impure, and the structure itself becomes impure as well. One is not forbidden to become impure, but one is forbidden to enter the temple or be in contact with certain sanctified object while impure until a certain time passes or a certain ritual is performed. The ritual to purify one from the impurity of human corpse, which is the highest level of impurity, so far worse, for example, for impurity when you touch a dead animal or a menstruating woman, is extremely complicated. One must use the so-called lustral water produced in the time of the temple from a so-called red heifer. Producing new lustral water today would be complicated. Some experts of Jewish law believe it is impossible. Others think it is feasible, but needs huge planning. Without lustral water, there is no way to become pure again. Is this a problem? That depends. For an average observant Jew today, it really is not. Jewish law assumes that all Jews, sooner or later, come in contact with a dead person. And it is probably true. Any Jew who ever visited a Jewish cemetery or in a hospital when a Jewish person died in the same building are likely to have attracted this impurity. What is even worse, because this impurity has no vertical limit, if one ever flew over a place where remains of dead Jews are in the ground, one possibly becomes impure. A few flights over Israel, Europe, or New Jersey, and mission accomplished. One is possibly impure. Still, as I said, this has almost no implications. Jews have no temple to go to, so an impurity status is almost irrelevant. But the rabbis have different considerations for various reasons. To begin with, even after the temple was destroyed in the year 70, some Jews continued to keep the laws of purity. Many rabbis also hoped for a quick reconstruction of the temple and wanted to be ready. They continued to discuss issues related to impurity or sacrifices in all seriousness, as if it had implications in the present. Today, there is one group of Jews for whom this issue is still of importance. Observant Jews who have a family tradition that they come from a priestly line. Often, their last name will be Cohen or Kaplan or Katz. For them, it is important to try to remain pure as much as possible. If the Messiah comes tomorrow and the temple is built the following day, they had better be ready to work there. In the image on the right that you see there is a warning for such people. Do not walk under the tree which is above this sign, because this tree also covers some graves in the adjacent cemetery in Jerusalem, and therefore acts as a tent. Walking under it will make one impure. Then comes Rabbi Simon Bar Yochai, a famous rabbi of the 1st century CE. He is so famous that the most important medieval work of Kabbalah, the Zohar, composed in Spain in the 13th century, was attributed to him. Simon objects. For him, the grave of idolaters do not transmit impurity in the way I described. How does he justify this different status he attributes to them? By saying they are holier than Jews and therefore not impure? Of course not. He does so by using a verse and explaining it in a unique way. The verse addresses God-chosen people and calls them Edom. Rabbi Simon Bar Yochai thus concludes that the idolaters, those who are not part of these people, are not Edom. They are, in our words, not fully human. Therefore, their corpses does not transmit the high-level impurity known as the impurity of human corpse. I suspect most people in this room do not like this idea. Me too. But there are two important facts that should be added to this story. The first is that the Talmudic text does not give Simon the last word. Other rabbis disagree. The second is that it is possible his main intention was to reduce the ways impurity could be acquired, for practical reasons. Declaring that non-Jews do not transfer impurity was certainly an efficient way of doing so. Thus, in a small sample of answer regarding the question of who is human, one text quoted a rabbi as saying that all humans are special in some way, or the Jews are even more special. In George Orwell's words, all are equal, but some are more equal than others. Another text quoted another rabbi as saying that non-Jews are not fully human. Other rabbis immediately contested this text, and it is also possible the main goal of the quoted rabbi was to solve technical legal issues, not to denigrate non-Jews. In later generations, though, and until today, some Jewish authors openly use this last text to say non-Jews are not fully human. In short, on this question, we have a mixed rabbinic bag. We have now some ideas about the definition of humanity in the views of some of the rabbis. What about the issue of rights? This is another complicated issue, but this time it is not the fault of the rabbis and not something we should look for in the literature they produced. Scholars of human rights tell us that the idea of right of a person has is modern. In earlier societies, a person, by being a person, had mostly obligations. Obligations to other members of the society, to the gods, to those who represented them. Rights could be gained individually or as a group, for example, guild, ethnic group, religious group, clan, but someone had to confer these rights explicitly. Among the rights one could have had, some are reminiscent of modern rights. A citizen of Rome had certain legal rights, for example, the right to be judged under Roman law. Jews in Frankfurt in the 18th century had the right to ask for protection of the emperor in Vienna against their own city's authorities. A member of the Guild of Cheesemakers in Paris in the 13th century had the right to earn a living by producing and selling cheese. However, all these rights were not automatic. They needed to be reaffirmed regularly and could have been revoked. The modern concept of human rights describes rights that are automatic for humans, need not be reaffirmed, and cannot be revoked. The rabbis, like others of earlier times, could not imagine such a thing. We cannot blame them for this. Starting now with a successive examination of several of the rights defined in the Declaration of 1948, let us go back to Article 1, but this time focus on its ending. So all humans should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Ringing a bell? Sounds familiar? Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. In 1958, when the memory of the Holocaust was still relatively fresh, and the State of Israel was interested in the idea of universal human rights, Israel issued a stamp to mark the 10-year anniversary of the Declaration. I was not there, but I can well imagine the meeting of the graphic designers who planned the stamp. Maybe one of them, let's call him Moshe, said, "So what can we say? How can we give the impression that we have contributed to this great document?" "Ah, Eureka," said another. "Let's call her Daphne. Let's create something that looks old and write in it in the biblical words, Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, with translation into various languages. We can thus claim that we, the Jews, were the first to think about human rights." "Brilliant," concluded Yossi. "It's a deal." Well, these three Hebrew words can be understood in various ways. In the original biblical context, there are reasons to doubt they are a call to universal love. Some of the doubts are because of the words themselves. Some are because of the general context of the verse. Let us begin with the word themselves. We have three words, Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. The first one can be translated as thou shalt love or like. This does not require defining what loving or liking means. The two other words are much more complicated. L're'echa is a form of the term rea. It appears in many places in the Bible. In modern Hebrew, it means friend, but this makes no sense in the biblical context. One does not need to be instructed to like one's friends, maybe on Facebook, but not other than that. It most likely means someone physically close to you, or in short, neighbor. In a larger context, it could mean someone from your social group, or in short, another Israelite. The third word, kamocha, like you, can mean that you should love the person in question like you love yourself, or that the person you must love should be similar to you. Something like, you should love those who are like you. The first reading is the one more commonly found in translations. The second one makes more sense if the text speaks about liking someone from your own group or a neighbor. If you look at the context of these three words in the Bible, things become even clearer. I will not read this, just want you to see. This is the text from Leviticus. At the very end you see, but love your neighbor as yourself. What I did here, all the words in blue are words that are related to some relation. As you can see, all of them are for people pretty close to you. Your fellow, neighbor, brother, your people. The text speaks about social relations inside the group of the Israelites. It has no intention to preach anything about relations with people outside of this group. Reading this text as meaning something universal is taking it out of context. Now, I'm not saying that there is something wrong with using a text out of its context. This is how text-based religions make their living. But one should be aware of it. If one believes the text was composed by God or Moses or some priest in Jerusalem, one should realize that God, Moses, or that priest most probably did not have any universal intentions about it. The rabbis realized it, and in this particular case refused, it seems, to read it out of context. Some of them even chose to read it in a manner even narrower than what the text might have meant. Very explicitly, rabbis said that the text refers only to social relations among Jews, and even then, not to all Jews. Some derived from it, for example, the obligation to hate certain type of Jews. Others found the rule useful to annul certain vows, if need be. But the three most common use of this verse by the rabbis were the following three. First was the idea that intimate relations during the day or in the light are inappropriate, because if a husband notices some blemish in his wife's body, he might hate her and transgress this law. The second was the idea that for the same reason, a man should not marry a woman he does not really want. The third was the obligation to perform capital punishment in a way that is, under the limits of the law, the least painful and humiliating. That is all. There is no major discussion of the verse with relation to more common and usual scenarios. It is very possible that many people think the biblical verse in question is universal and central because Jesus quoted it according to the New Testament, presenting it as if it is part of the so-called Ten Commandments. But it is not, at least not in the Jewish Bible and not in texts that Jews consider authoritative. Did Jesus mean it to be universal? I doubt it, but it is outside of our topic of discussion. The rabbinic text that comes closest to making the idea central is a charming story about Hillel, a rabbinic hero from the 1st century CE. It happens that a certain heathen came before Shammai and said to him, "Make me a proselyte on condition that you teach me the whole Torah while I stand on one foot." Thereupon he repulsed him with the builder's cubit which was in his hand. When he went before Hillel, he made him a proselyte and said to him, "What is hateful to you, do not to your neighbor. That is the whole Torah, while the rest is the commentary thereof. Go and learn it." The text does not state that Hillel quoted a biblical text. In fact, and the idea he professed is similar but not identical. He used also text he spoke in Aramaic, which makes sense, but it's not even a translation of the biblical text. This might be another proof that the rabbis did not consider the verse from Leviticus as preaching what many of us have come to believe or to want to believe it means. Let us go now to other articles in the Universal Declaration. It would be a waste of time to look for parallels for some articles, as the rabbinic literature is not committed to such values. For example, discrimination based on sex or religion is natural for the rabbinic literature and to many other religious literature, and we should not be surprised that text like the one see here is not in the rabbinic literature. The things that we have here, that no discrimination based on race, color, sex, language, religion, political, other opinion, will be practically meaningless for the rabbis, and this is the reality. But the following article, Article 3, is worth more consideration. Everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. This article is rather vague and does not prevent states from doing things such as arresting a person, even if by such an act they limit the person's liberty, or even executing a person, although that is an irreversible act against the person's rights to life. Admittedly, other articles require a fair trial and equality in front of the law, thus trying to prevent governments from performing such an act at whim, but the Declaration does not forbid the death penalty. At the same time, the ideal envisaged by the creators of the text is that the death penalty should be abolished, or at the very least that its use should be extremely rare. If this is how we understand the right to life in the article, we can applaud the rabbis. According to the reading of the rabbis, the Pentateuch prescribes the death penalty for those who committed any one of the sins in the lower part of this slide. According to the reading of the rabbis, the Pentateuch also prescribes karet, often translated as cutting off, to additional 36 transgressions. So we have 36 transgressions that are on the category of karet, and another you see a big list of others. The rabbis said that this cutting off is actually death by the hands of heaven, meaning not by human courts. God will decide how and when. Human courts are not in charge. Early Christian authors and some Jewish authors of different times thought this distinction is false and baseless, and that the Bible meant that courts should execute people also for these transgressions. One can say, therefore, that the rabbis took most of the sins the Bible considers capital out of the hands of the courts. This is not a small feat. What about those that they still kept under the authority of human courts? The Talmudic literature, through various interpretive tools, made many of these transgressions also a dead letter of the law by requiring impossible conditions to justify an execution. At times, this was done in discussions of specific sins. Thus, for example, to execute a rebellious son, his parents should look and sound absolutely identical to one another, while still being a male and female. Obviously, this is not something that happens very often, and without this, according to the Talmud, you cannot execute this rebellious son. At other times, this was done with regard to all types of sins. Thus, for example, to execute a person, the Talmud requires that in addition to two absolutely impeccable witnesses for the sin itself, there will be two impeccable witnesses who can testify they told the person explicitly before committing the crime that what he or she was about to do is a sin and that he or she would be executed for this. The person must respond that he or she is aware of the law, knows that he or she is going to be executed, but is doing it anyway. Without this, the person cannot be sentenced to death, according to the rabbis. Needless to say, the likelihood of such scenario is very slim. If someone would commit the sin anyway after such a warning, I can imagine his or her lawyer arguing that this shows the wrongdoer was insane and thus also not executable. The Talmud tells us that executions were extremely rare. I do not know if this is historical account. However, courts that, in theory, meticulously followed the Talmudic regulation on the matter would have authorized a much lower number of executions than courts that meticulously, theoretically, followed the biblical law. Just like the Universal Declaration, the rabbi did not outlaw executions, but they made them extremely rare. They respected person's right to life much more than the authors of the Pentateuch did. I'm not going to read all this. You know what? You can maybe read for a second. So these are articles 6 to 11 that speaks about issue of law. You got the general point, I'm sure. This article of the Universal Declaration deals with the right to have equal standing before the law and to enjoy a fair trial. There is an interesting parallel in the rabbinic tradition. In the Bible, one can find many texts calling for justice and fair trials, but the Bible is, very important exceptions aside, some in the prophetic literature, but generally, mostly interested in the Israelites. The rabbis went one step further, demanding non-Jews to do the same. The rabbinic tradition holds the idea that the vast majority of God's commandments are for Jews alone to follow, but that God also gave the non-Jews a small number of commandments they must follow. Generally, the rabbis identify 7 of these commandments. The rabbis were looking for commandments given to the sons of Noah, considering that this was the last moment God spoke to all of humanity. After this, the human race divided into clans and people and spread. Explicitly, two commandments of this kind appear in the book of Genesis: the prohibition of murder and the prohibition against consuming animal blood. The rabbis read the second one as prohibiting eating a living animal or a part of a member of a living animal, an organ. They also added another 5 that are not explicit in the Bible. One of them is the obligation to have courts of law. Babylonian Talmud Sanhedrin. It has been taught, just as the Israelites were ordered to set up law courts in every district and town, so are the sons of Noach likewise enjoined to set up law courts in every district and town. Thus, non-Jews without a court systems are transgressing one of the most elementary rules of human society according to the rabbinic tradition. According to a rather common rabbinic view, such a society does not merit to be called human one. This commandment is less detailed than the articles in the Universal Declaration, of course, but the same fundamental idea is found in both texts. Human societies must have an established legal system. In a later written version of this talk, I plan to analyze parallels to the following articles from the Universal Declaration. Some are fascinating, and there is much to say: freedom from slavery, torture, right of privacy and honor, and you see in others, and I'm sure you can imagine by reading them some possible parallels. Today, before I conclude, I would like to devote some time to another 2 articles, 16 and 26. Let us begin with Article 16, the right to marriage and family. Men and women of full age, without any limitation due to race, nationality, or religion, have the right to marry and to found a family. They are entitled to equal rights as to marriage, during marriage and its dissolution. Marriage shall be entered into only with the free and full consent of intending spouses. And third, the family is the natural and fundamental group unit of society and is entitled to protection by society and the state. The parts in it that I believe we can find parallels to in the rabbinic tradition are those underlined. That there are parallels does not mean, of course, that they are similar. Far from it. Regarding all these questions, the rabbinic tradition includes very different opinions. Without any limitation due to religion? Of course not. According to the rabbis, Jews can only marry Jews. A marriage of a Jew with a non-Jew is not valid. In some aspects, even a union of 2 non-Jews is not fully binding from the perspective of Jewish law. Men and women are entitled to equal rights as to marriage during marriage and its dissolution? No, no, and no. The entire system of rabbinic marriage is based on difference between the spouses in rights and obligations before the marriage, during the marriage, and with regards to divorce. Even the question of consent is not obvious because young girls could be married, as I will discuss promptly. Can we find anything positive from our perspective in the rabbinic tradition in comparison to this human rights number 16? The first that I think is a right that a growing number among us supports today, but that even the author of the Universal Declaration do not mention. Yes, the big elephant in any room, gay marriage. The rabbis imagine a marriage of 2 men, but say it's an aberration. However, they have serious discussions about the possibility of marriage of intersex people, born with a reproductive or sexual anatomy that does not seem to fit the typical definition of female or male. So maybe we can speak about queer marriage and not gay marriage in this context. Can they marry, and with whom? We can imagine a society, and maybe there was one, in which such people would be forbidden for marriage. The rabbinic tradition speaks about these issues in a number of places, and generally concludes that yes, such a person can marry a woman. They cannot marry a male in case they are male themselves. This would lead to homosexual relations. But they can marry a female. If they are male, then everything is perfectly kosher. If they are female, then this marriage is not more than a union of 2 females, something that the rabbinic tradition, following the Bible, which ignores it, had a relatively minor objection to. The centrality of marriage causes the rabbinic tradition in this case to tend towards permitting what we would call queer marriage for such people rather than forbidding it. The second issue is the question of full age. In many countries today, the laws define this age somewhere between 16 and 18 years old. The rabbinic tradition also defines minimal age for marriage, for males. The rabbis sometimes define this minimal age by chronological age, 13, and sometimes by biology, when certain elements of puberty appeared. Before that, a boy could not marry. Marriage is a financial transaction in which the male acquires a female, and a minor cannot complete financial transactions. With regard to girls, the situation is different. Before a certain age, or before a certain point of sexual maturity, a girl is still in some ways the property of her father, who can give her away in marriage at any age. If she does not have a father, according to the way the rabbis perceive the biblical law, she cannot be married before maturity. She must wait. The rabbinic tradition adds, though, a solution to such a case. A girl whose father had died can be given in marriage by her mother or by her elder brother. However, this marriage is not as binding as a regular marriage until puberty. And if the girl says before that time that she does not want it, it is automatically annulled without the need for divorce. Whether the rabbis improved the situation of such girls or made it worse is difficult to say. In a society in which many girls were married at a very young age, being not only orphaned but excluded from the marital market while other girls could get good catches was perhaps an additional disadvantage. On the other hand, maybe not being married too young was a good thing for them. Perhaps we can simply not make any clear-cut declaration about it. Each individual case was probably unique. In the Talmudic period, the rabbis do something more. They try to discourage, if not to entirely forbid, the marriage of young girls, even though they believed the Torah permitted it. The extent to which they were successful is unclear. Maybe the repetitive strong admonitions against it hints that such marriages were indeed common. We simply do not know what the reality was. But we can credit some rabbis for attempting to discourage such unions of very young girls. However, in later periods, and particularly in some places and times in the Middle Ages, marriage of young Jewish girls were again common. The rabbis of the time interpreted the Talmudic rabbis' words against this practice as mere advice, not an actual prohibition, and not one that must be followed at all scenarios. Marriage of very young girls was again in fashion. The last human rights I would like to briefly discuss is the right to education. Article 26 in the Universal Declaration is devoted to it. Everyone has the right to education. Education shall be free, at least in the elementary and fundamental stages. Elementary education shall be compulsory. Technical and professional education shall be made generally available, and higher education shall be equally accessible to all on the basis of merit. Education shall be directed to the full development of the human personality and to the strengthening of respect for human rights and fundamental freedom. It shall promote understanding, tolerance, friendship among all nations, racial or religious group, and shall further the activities of the United Nations for the maintenance of peace. Talk about self-promotion. Parents have a prior right to choose the kind of education that shall be given to their children. The rabbis cannot be credited with following all the sublime ideas in this article, but there are some elements they thought about more than 1,500 years ago. I refer to the highlighted words. This intersects on many levels with rabbinical discussions. The issue here includes whether education should be universal, free, and compulsory, who should have access to it, and what elements of knowledge should be included in this education. Various outstanding modern scholars have explored, on the one hand, the wishes and regulation of some of the rabbis on the matter, and on the other hand, the reality that we can learn from rabbinic text, from archaeology, and from comparisons to surrounding cultures. They have shown, for example, an astonishing gap between rabbinic texts that praise education and rabbinic texts that see teachers as a detestable group with whom one should not mingle. We have texts that describe a reality as if all children went to school, together with texts that tell us about several major rabbis, the most famous among which is the same Rabbi Akiva mentioned at the very beginning of this talk, who is said to have never frequented a school before he was 40 years old. We have texts that say that children should be accepted to school based on their merit, together with texts that show the poor were not admitted. That girls were excluded seems almost obvious. We have texts that speak about the obligation of communities to collect money from everybody and pay the teachers, together with texts that show teachers were paid, if at all, by the children's parents. In short, a large gap existed between the ideals of some of the rabbis and the reality of which they were a part. However, some had high ideals, saying, for example, that a father is obligated not only to take care of the religious and secular education of his child, including teaching the child the craft, but also teach him a rather surprising skill. The father is bound in respect of his son to circumcise, redeem, teach him Torah, take a wife for him, and teach him a craft. Some say to teach him to swim too. Rabbi Judah said, he who does not teach his son a craft teaches him brigandage. Brigandage? Can you really think so? But it is as though he taught him brigandage. Perhaps the obligation to teach a child how to swim is part of what the Universal Declaration called the full development of human personality. Did the Jewish tradition contribute significantly to our definition of human rights? I do not know. Some Jews, as individuals, did. The Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 was largely drafted by the French Jewish jurist René Cassin on the left. And people like Rabbi Meyer and Rabbi Heschel, you see on the center and right, fought for others to have many of these rights. Some of the rabbis of the ancient world had interesting ideas and concepts we can associate today with our understanding of human rights. I do not think we can call them groundbreakers, but we should also not ignore some of their contributions to human rights. Thank you. If there are questions, I'm happy to. Yes.
Terminology. In modern Hebrew, there is a term for rights, zechuyot.
Right.
But I think that's a really very, very recent addition to the Hebrew language. In your research, have you come across any word at all that resonates with however you want to understand what rights means? What would be a rabbinic term that's equivalent to the notion of right?
It's a great question. Zechuyot, certainly not. This will not be there, because zechut will be often with a connection to mitzvah, to commandments, or I do a kiddush for someone that I make him zakai, give him some benefit of some kind. It's related often to some kind of benefits. So it's not that. I do not know, and I have to think about it. I doubt there is, as I said earlier, and I was in the recent weeks, I'm deeply reading a big, major book about the history of human rights. It would be surprising to find anything like this because it is a modern concept. Because of everything I said, in order to have these rights, you also have to have kind of a government, or you have to have some group that gives these rights. Do you think about it in term?
No, I can speak to the medieval stuff that I've been working with.
Which terms you would use?
Medieval Hebrew literature, rabbinic.
What term would it?
No term.
There is no term.
There is no term.
Right. I think also I think the rabbinic literature also does not have term. There's zechut. The whole idea is 17th, 18th century, starting. And well, often Jews get things a little later. So I would be surprised if anything equivalent. But also in other languages, there were no terms like this. So I don't think the Jews are so bad about that. It was just did not exist in this idea was not there. Yeah. Yes.
About the rabbi's limitation of capital punishment. Could you say that they really were doing the best that they could in terms of limiting it? Because after all, the Torah does provisions for capital punishment, so that's a given. So, it would be, I mean, their procedure is somewhat like, people today who are trying to outlaw capital punishment by showing that there's no fair way of enforcing it. And so, you can't, I mean, these are people who would like to just prohibit capital punishment, completely, but they can't do that, so that they set up conditions which can never be fulfilled.
Right.
And but the only difference would be if, like the American Constitution, did have, capital punishment built into it, which it has not. But so like the Constitution of Israel, the Torah, does have capital punishment there as a presupposition. So could you say that the rabbis did as much as they could to limit it, given that it's there in the sort of founding documents?
I mean, I think the comparison to what you said, what is done today, what with only advocates against capital punishment, knowing the reality, knowing they cannot just make it disappear, but they try, it's a very good example, very good parallel to what the rabbis did. Did they do the most they could do? I do not know. I mean, I'm sure you could always think of more things. I mean, so I will not give them that credit. They could have invented even more. They invented really crazy conditions sometimes, okay? And we see it in different cases in order to, that seems how the witnesses should be interrogated, okay? You should scare them. You should ask the most tiny details. And now, is this most they could do? Maybe they could do even more conditions to say. The conditions that they say about the son, the rebellious son, this is a good example of a condition that cannot be met. Okay? So, and they take a little text, because the Bible says, "Velakhu oto aviv ve'imo," so his father and mother take him, so they say they should take him in the same way, both of them, by everything. They should have the same force, the same look, the same voice, the same everything. Okay? Doesn't happen too often. So basically they made it impossible. Now, what the reality was, I do not know. We also know, and many here know, that some of the statements of the rabbinic literature about not executing people might be to save themselves from death of Jesus. That might be another one possibility, that's saying that 40 years before the temple was destroyed, the Sanhedrin did not execute people. That might be, we're not guilty. So we do not know the reality. What I can say that if we have two courts, one or the other, one is doing things according to what seems to be a reasonable reading of the biblical law, and one is doing what seems to be a reasonable reading of the Talmudic law, that court will kill many more people than this one. That's a step. Yeah. Yes.
Hi, my name is Diraz Cohen, and my last name is Cohen, and I'm part of this thing that you mentioned. My father and my brother are not coming to the cemetery, and you said that women are not the same, they are not equal in the same thing. It's just something that I just want to clarify. It's just, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, that this is because women weren't working at the temple, so they didn't need to be that pure as the men that worked at the temple. Like the Cohen people, they worked in the temple, and it was like really close to God, so that's the reason they need to save themselves to be pure. But I just want to say that I'm happy that I'm not part of this, because my brother and my father, they can't go to see, for example, my grandma, like.
And because cemeteries are one of the most beautiful things we have often. Beautiful place to visit sometimes. Another way, but, right. Or family, right.
Yeah.
Right.
Just terminology.
I just want to say, I did not say, I don't think I said specifically, I did not speak in that case about women in the issue of priests. I don't think I said that, as maybe in other context. Women priests should, or women of priests should be pure for other things in order to eat certain tithes, certain things that they should be consumed in purity. But this is less urgent. They can wait some time. So if the temple can be built, they can find so-called red heifer, they can produce the thing. It's less urgent. They may have a week or so, and till then they maybe they can eat sandwiches from somewhere. But for the men, it's in theory is more crucial. There's another group, taking this, there's another group, I did not mention it for a reason, those Jews today that are planning the building of the third temple. They are also extremely interested in that, and they become more and more powerful, and the groups are clearly, we saw there is a rise in their importance. And there are, and I was reading many articles written by people of that group of how they can produce this red heifer, this para aduma today. It is very complicated because you need, the most important thing is that you need a pure priest, a pure Kohen to perform the ritual. And there are no, in theory. So one can raise them. So in theory you can take, there are, I read very practical plans. You can acquire a big area which is in Jerusalem, which is above a rock, and which there is it's empty under it, so impurity does not pass, and you should raise children from their birth on this area, and then when they are about 13, they will be able to do that. So they have plans for that, but happily, it is very complicated. Yeah.
My question was just like out of interest. You said Israel and Palestine. You mentioned those two words.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned the same thing. So I just wanted to ask, like, why do you call it Palestine and not Israel? And you said it's only Jews call Israel Israel.
I did not say that only Jews call Israel Israel. I never said that. I said we use in academic circles, we use Palestine. This was the name of the area. It was not called Israel. Jews called it Eretz Israel. The name Israel appeared in 1948 by a decision of some people, mostly Ben Gurion. Many other people wanted other names. People wanted to call it Judah or Sharona or Carmel. There are many different names. So this is a recent thing. So anything before 1948 happened in that land can be or called, if you use Jewish terms, Eretz Israel, or if you use universal terms, is Palestine. Yes.
I have two questions. It seems like a nice answer to say, as far as the Cohen, the women can't do it because the man is in the temple. But I think, in general, women, from my reasoning, the Torah says the man does it, and that's it. And women in general are exempt from anything that's most, unless it's time bound, I believe.
These are rabbinic traditions.
So why use this particular case? Well, they don't want to be close to. I mean, do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, again, I did not say, I don't think I said anything about particular issue related to women that are wives or daughters of priests. I don't think I spoke about it in any point whatsoever. What you say, yeah.
I have another question.
Okay.
Maybe I missed it. In the middle of the lecture, there was a picture of a mom and a pop. What was it?
That look the same.
Yeah.
I just took a picture outside.
Mama, and there were two men, and maybe I missed the significance
Okay.
of the man being in the mom picture.
Okay, so there is this story the Bible says about a rebellious child that is doing, I don't know, terrible things. He eats, he drinks, he's not very happy, he have I guess some attention deficit disorder or something like this. And according to the Bible, you should, of course, when you have a son like this that is rebellious, obviously you should take the son, get out to the gate of the town and stone him to death. And that's how you should do it. Pretty obvious. The rabbis are not happy with this idea. So the rabbis try to create a system in which this doesn't happen. So they invent things. They say, if the Torah says that his father and mother should take him outside to the city gate, so they say, father and mother, let us think about it. That means that the father and mother should look exactly the same. Did the Torah mean that? Did the Torah mean it? No, I don't think. But they try, like we have the example we hear with modern campaigns against death penalty in this country, they try to find ways to make it impossible. So one of the conditions they said is that a son like this can be executed only if the father and the mother of the son look exactly the same and sound exactly the same and have the same height. If you find a family like this, you can execute a son. Obviously, they did it in order to avoid it because you cannot find family like this. Obviously, they did not mean a gay marriage. They meant a female and a male that still look the same. So this is kind of a trick that they used in order to reduce the possibility to execute.
And if a ben sorer was executed in any period of time, it's considered a bloody court or something like the same.
There are some texts that say that court that executed once every 70 years is a bloody, Katlan is a bloody court. Some say that every 7 years. I don't think we know the reality of how many executions happened. So everything we talk here is about the theory. I can give an example recently from a colleague that is working on Muslim law. He told me that according to historic records, until modern time, until colonialism, in all Muslim courts, source, and evidence, there is one and perhaps two cases of execution of a woman for not being faithful to her husband in all the Islamic world. So, and this also is something that works. We know about the idea of Foucault that you have to, it's much more important to make people scared. People think that there are big punishments happen around. You don't really have to punish. So the reality, how many executions have taken place among Jews, Israelites, I do not know. All I can say is about the legal, it's legal fantasy. What the rabbis did, they wrote about time in which they did not have authority anymore, of things like this. But in their fantasy, a court would kill significantly less people than a court would according to the biblical law. That's all I can say. Yes?
I wonder if you explored any of the tractates and Seder Nezikim and damages.
Mm-hmm.
It strikes me as just a good place to look for rabbinic ideas on the rights of the individual.
On rights of property, there is there.
Property,
Yeah.
but also damages suffered, injuries, and that sort of thing. And I'm just wondering if there's been any work comparing that to contemporaneous Roman law. If we can somehow get a sense of where the rabbis stand.
There are boxers and others. And as I said, you see, that's the plan for the future. I did not want to make it a talk of 2 hours. For example, the right to own property is there. So you do have things. You have even already in the Mishnah the idea of Yehi mamon chavercha chaviv alecha keshelcha, that the property of your fellow man should be cherished by you as if yours, something like this. So we have things like this, and also we have this in Nezikin, in damages, absolutely. But I decided not to make it too long. Anything? So thank you very much. Thank you.